At 2:15 on the morning of August 7th, 1944, Sergeant Robert Callahan crouched low behind the steel shield of his 3-inch M5 anti-tank gun, his gloved hands pressed against the cold metal as he listened to something enormous moving through the darkness. He couldn't see it. No one could. The fog had swallowed the Norman countryside whole. It clung to the hedgerows and fields like a living thing, thick and absolute, reducing the world to a circle barely 15 feet wide. Beyond that, there was nothing. No horizon. No sky. No enemy. Only sound. And the sound was unmistakable. Heavy engines. Deep, mechanical, deliberate. German tanks. Callahan was 26 years old and had spent 11 months with the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. He had trained in Texas under wide, open skies where targets stood clearly against the horizon. He had learned range estimation, ballistic trajectories, deflection angles. He had learned to destroy tanks he could see. He had never trained for this. He had never trained to fight blind. His gun, dug into the earth just east of the French town of Mortain, was a towed M5 anti-tank weapon. 3 tons of steel designed to fire 76mm armor-piercing shells capable of penetrating German Panther tanks at over 1,000 yards. If you could see them, if you could aim, if you had time. But none of those conditions existed now. The fog had rolled in shortly after midnight, thick summer ground fog rising from the damp Norman fields. It turned the terrain into an endless gray void where distance, direction, and certainty ceased to exist. Callahan's crew waited beside him. 5 men, a gunner gripping the traverse wheels. A loader crouched beside stacked ammunition crates. 2 ammunition handlers ready to feed shells into the breach. All of them silent. All of them listening. The 823rd had arrived at Mortain 3 days earlier alongside the 30th Infantry Division. Intelligence had warned them that German armor was massing to the east. For entire panzer divisions, elite units, the 1st SS Leibstandard, the 2nd SS Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, nearly 200 tanks. Their mission was simple: break through American lines, reach the coast at Avranches, cut the Allied advance in half, destroy everything behind it. The Americans had 12 towed guns to stop them, 12 guns that couldn't move once battle began. Callahan had studied the tactical mathematics all night. His M5 could destroy a Panther side armor at 1,500 yards. At closer ranges, maybe even the front armor if the angle was favorable. But that assumed vision, aim, control, none of which existed in the fog. Radio silence had been ordered at midnight. Battalion headquarters didn't want German direction-finding units locating their positions. So now the only information came through sound, and the sound was getting closer. Callahan heard the distinct metallic rhythm of Panther tank road wheels, different from American Shermans. Heavier, lower, more deliberate. He counted by ear. 1 engine, 2, 3, at least 6 tanks in the lead element. More behind them. A column, moving straight toward his gun. The men waited. No one spoke. At 2:43, the first German tank fired. The muzzle flash exploded through the fog 200 yards ahead, a sudden orange bloom that illuminated the mist for a fraction of a second. Then the shell screamed overhead. It passed somewhere above Callahan's position and detonated behind them in a violent burst of earth and steel. Another flash. Another shot. The Germans were firing blind. And in that moment, Callahan understood something critical. If he could see their flashes, they could see his. The first gun to fire would reveal itself. The first gun to fire would die. He had seconds to decide. Do nothing and be overrun. Or fire blind and hope to survive the retaliation. Callahan raised his hand and signaled. The gunner traversed left. The loader slammed a high explosive round into the breech. There was no time to load armor-piercing ammunition. Fire now, or never. Callahan dropped his hand. The gun fired. The recoil slammed backward, driving the trails into the earth as the muzzle flash lit the fog like lightning. For 3 seconds, the world existed. The hedgerows, the ground, the men. Then darkness returned. And somewhere ahead, 15 seconds later, an explosion. A violent, catastrophic explosion, followed by secondary detonations. Ammunition cooking off. They had hit something. They had fired blind and destroyed a German tank. Callahan didn't celebrate. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8, 9, 10. Move. The crew leapt into action. 5 men grabbed the gun trails, dragging the 3-ton weapon 30 feet north, muscles straining, boots slipping in the wet earth. They dug it in again. Loaded armor piercing. Waited. Seconds later, German shells slammed into their previous position. 3 impacts in rapid succession. The Germans were firing at memory. At where the flash had been. Not where the gun was now. The fog had saved them. Another German muzzle flash appeared to the east. Callahan gave the order. Fire. Another explosion. Another burning panther. This became their tactic. Fire at the flash. Move immediately. Fire again before the Germans adjusted. It was madness. It was improvisation. It was survival. All along the American line, other guns joined the fight. Muzzle flashes erupted through the fog like lightning strikes. Each one revealing its position. Each one drawing return fire. At 3 o'clock, one of the guns 200 yards south was hit. Callahan heard the impact. Heard the ammunition explode. Then silence. 1 gun gone. 11 remaining. The German tanks stopped advancing. Their engines idled as they maneuvered cautiously, trying to locate enemies they could not see. Callahan's crew was completely exposed. The M5 gun shield could stop rifle bullets. It meant nothing against tank fire. If a Panther closed within 300 yards, the crew would die. Simple mathematics. At 3:20, shapes appeared in the fog. Infantry. German Panzer Grenadiers. They moved cautiously forward, probing for gun positions. If they found Callahan's crew, they would mark the position. And tanks would finish the job. One of Callahan's ammunition handlers gripped a Thompson submachine gun. But firing it would reveal everything. Callahan made another calculation. Wait. Wait longer. Let them get closer. 50 feet. 40. 30. 20. He raised his hand. The Thompson fired. 3-round bursts tore into the fog. German soldiers dropped instantly. Others fled. But the damage was done. German tanks now knew exactly where Callahan's gun was. Move. The crew dragged the gun again. Seconds later, tank shells obliterated their previous position. By 4 o'clock, Company A had lost 5 guns. Nearly half their strength. But they had destroyed 9 German tanks. 9 Panthers. 9 monsters of steel. The fog began to thin. Visibility increased. Which made everything worse. Because now, the Germans could see them too. By 4:15, the fog was no longer their ally. It still clung to the ground, still blurred distance and shape, but it was thinning. It was becoming transparent enough to betray them. The German tanks, which had spent hours firing blind, were beginning to see. And seeing meant maneuver. Callahan could hear it before he could fully confirm it. The grinding advance of Panther tanks pushing forward with renewed confidence. Their engines no longer hesitated. Their tracks bit into the wet Norman soil with purpose. They were hunting now. Then, from behind him, from the west, came another sound. American engines. Higher pitched. Faster. Shermans. Callahan turned instinctively toward the noise. Through the gray veil, shapes appeared. Rounded turrets. Familiar silhouettes. Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion. Reinforcements. They had been held in reserve behind the lines, waiting for the decisive moment. Now they were here. But Callahan knew the mathematics. Shermans versus Panthers in close quarters was not an equal equation. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled against the Panther's thick frontal armor. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm cannon could destroy a Sherman from any angle at nearly any distance. The Shermans were brave. But bravery did not thicken armor. The radio crackled beside Callahan. Static. Then a voice. Company A, hold position. Repeat, hold position. The order was absolute. The 30th Infantry Division was falling back behind them, withdrawing to secondary defensive lines. Company A's guns were now the shield. They could not retreat. They could not reposition beyond their assigned sector. They could only hold. Until the infantry escaped. Callahan checked his ammunition. 47 rounds remained. Mixed armor piercing and high explosive. At their current rate of fire, 90 minutes. Maybe less. Dawn was still nearly 2 hours away. Air support would not come until daylight. If they survived that long. At 4:30, another gun position to the south vanished in fire. Callahan saw the flash through the fog, heard the detonation. Then nothing. 6 guns left. The Germans were dismantling them methodically, one position at a time. Their advance resembled a tightening noose, drawing closer with each minute. The tactical equation had changed. Before, the fog had protected them. Now, it was abandoning them. At 4:45, Callahan saw death emerging through the mist. A Panther tank, 300 yards ahead. Its dark silhouette appeared slowly, like a predator materializing from shadow. Its hull was partially concealed behind a hedgerow. Only its turret and upper hull were visible. Hull down position. Perfect defensive posture. Its turret rotated slowly, searching, looking, hunting. Callahan's gunner was already moving. The loader lifted an armor-piercing round into position. Callahan understood the reality. They would have one shot. Maybe two. If they were faster. If they were luckier. If they survived. The Panther's turret stopped moving. It pointed almost directly at them. Inside that steel turret, another gunner was making his own calculation. 2 men. 2 weapons. 2 decisions. Callahan raised his hand. Fire. Both guns fired at 4:47. The shells crossed in midair. The German shell struck the ground 6 feet in front of Callahan's position. It skipped upward, ricocheted over the gun barrel, and exploded 30 yards behind them. Callahan's shell hit the Panther square in the mantlet. The armor-piercing round penetrated the turret. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke poured from the commander's hatch. The turret froze. The tank stopped. Dead. Callahan exhaled. 10 tanks destroyed. 6 American guns remaining. The mathematics were deteriorating. By 5 o'clock, visibility had improved to nearly 200 yards. Enough to see. Enough to aim. Enough to die. The Germans no longer needed muzzle flashes. They could now see targets. Identify positions. Coordinate attacks. The advantage was gone. To the south, Shermans engaged the advancing German column. Callahan heard the distinct cracks of American tank guns. Then explosions. Then silence. The Shermans were dying. Their armor too thin. Their guns too weak. Their courage insufficient against physics. At 5:15, battalion radio reported the situation. Company A, 8 German tanks destroyed. Company B, 3 destroyed. For Sherman's lost. 2 more damaged. The German advance slowed, but had not stopped. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was pushing toward Mortain itself. If they reached Avranches, the entire Allied advance could collapse. Callahan's crew had fired 63 rounds. 21 armor-piercing shells remained. No high explosive. Every shot now had only one purpose. Kill tanks. At 5:30, salvation came from the sky, not in aircraft, but in artillery. American 105mm howitzers opened fire. Shells screamed overhead. Explosions erupted among German formations. They did not destroy Panthers, but they forced them to stop. Forced crews to close hatches. Forced hesitation. Callahan seized the opportunity. Move. His crew dragged the M5 gun 50 yards east, positioning behind a low stone wall. Better cover. Better concealment. But less room to escape. The enemy was closing. At 5:40, another American gun was overrun. Callahan saw it happen. German infantry advanced under Panther cover. The American crew fought back with rifles. Pistols. Desperation. 90 seconds later, they were gone. 5 guns remained. 5 guns against an army. The sky lightened. Visibility improved. 400 yards. 500. And with clarity came horror. German tanks filled the fields. Dozens of them. Panthers. Panzer IVs. A steel river flowing toward destruction. The column stretched half a mile across the countryside. Callahan understood the truth. They should already be dead. At 5:55, he saw movement on his flank. 3 Panthers advancing north of his position. Flanking maneuver. Professional. Precise. Elite SS troops. His choices were simple. Turn and engage, and die from the front. Hold position, and die from the flank. Abandon the gun, and live with failure. Then dawn arrived. At exactly 6 o'clock, the fog vanished. And Callahan saw the truth. He had been fighting the wrong enemy. The 30 tanks before him were not the main assault. They were a screen. A diversion. The real attack had passed south, 2 miles away. The Germans had broken through elsewhere. Company A had been fighting ghosts. But ghosts that mattered. Because for 4 hours, 5 guns had held 30 German tanks in place. Delayed them. Denied them movement. Denied them reinforcement of the main breakthrough. The value was not in destruction. It was in time. At 6:05, radio confirmed it. Hill 314 remained in American hands. Artillery observers still controlled the battlefield. The breakthrough was incomplete. The German tanks before Callahan began withdrawing at 6:15. Not retreating, repositioning. Their mission was finished. Callahan counted the cost. 5 guns destroyed, 30 men killed or wounded, 12 missing. In exchange, 11 German tanks destroyed, 6 more damaged. For hours stolen from the enemy. For hours that could decide a war. Then, at 6:20, the sky roared. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts arrived. American fighter bombers. They came low over the fields, engines screaming, rockets already firing. Callahan watched as 2 rockets struck a Panther directly. The explosion tore the turret from the hull. Steel lifted into the air, then fell. And for the first time that morning, the Germans were the ones dying without seeing their killers. The Thunderbolt did not miss. It came screaming out of the low cloud ceiling, its radial engine roaring with mechanical fury, its wings steady despite the turbulent air. Callahan watched as the fighter bomber released its payload, a single dark shape falling cleanly toward the retreating Panther below. The bomb struck 5 yards short. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the earth erupted. The blast lifted the 45-ton Panther as if gravity had loosened its grip. The concussion rolled beneath the hull, flipping the tank onto its side like a child's discarded toy. Dirt, steel fragments, and smoke exploded outward in a violent halo. No crew escaped. Callahan stared in silence. He had spent the night fighting those machines as if they were invincible. Now they were dying helplessly under the open sky. The German withdrawal collapsed into chaos. Panthers and Panzer IVs abandoned careful formations and began fleeing east toward their own lines. Engines screamed at maximum throttle. Tracks tore apart hedgerows. Some tanks tried to hide beneath trees or behind stone walls. It didn't matter. The Thunderbolts hunted them relentlessly. One after another, American fighter bombers swept across the countryside in low attack runs. Rockets slammed into retreating armor. Machine gun fire stitched lines of destruction across exposed vehicles. Bombs shattered columns of steel that had seemed unstoppable just hours earlier. The hunters had become the hunted. For 2 hours, the skies belonged entirely to the Americans. By 8 o'clock, the battlefield had transformed into a graveyard. 17 German tanks lay destroyed in front of Company A's positions. 11 had been killed by Callahan and his fellow gunners in the fog. 6 more by the Thunderbolts. Steel carcasses burned in the morning light. Smoke drifted upward in dark pillars. The smell of burning fuel and scorched metal filled the air. Callahan's crew sat beside their gun in exhausted silence. They had survived. Against mathematics. Against doctrine. Against reason. At 8:30, battalion headquarters issued new orders. Hold position. No pursuit. No advance. The Germans still held Mortain itself. Hill 314 remained surrounded. The battle was far from over. It had only changed shape. For the next hour, Callahan's crew moved across the battlefield recovering what they could. They found 3 damaged M5 guns that could be salvaged. Bent shields. Cracked wheels. Scarred barrels. Still usable. They gathered scattered ammunition. Collected abandoned equipment. And found bodies. American. German. The fog had hidden death. Daylight revealed it completely. At 9 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Dieter arrived. The battalion commander stepped slowly along the gun line. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He counted the destroyed guns. Counted the surviving crews. Counted the burned German tanks scattered across the fields. The numbers spoke clearly enough. By 9:30, the battlefield stabilized. The German breakthrough had failed. They had not reached Avranches. They had not cut the Allied supply lines. They had not stopped the American advance. Hill 314 still stood. From its summit, American forward observers could see everything. Every German movement. Every column. Every attempt to regroup. Artillery fire followed those observations relentlessly. The Germans could not maneuver without being seen. Could not advance without being targeted. The fog had given them surprise. But Callahan and the 823rd had taken away their speed. And without speed, the offensive died. The battle for Mortain would continue for 6 more days. But the decisive moment had already passed. It had passed at 2:15 that morning, when one American sergeant heard tanks in the fog and chose to fight. Over the following days, the strategic consequences became clear. Hitler had committed 4 panzer divisions to Operation Luttich, nearly 300 tanks, Germany's last armored reserves in Normandy. They were meant to cut through American lines and reach the sea, to isolate Patton's Third Army, to reverse the Allied breakout. But they failed, because they were delayed. Delayed long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Delayed long enough for air power to intervene. Delayed long enough for the Allied machine to respond. By August 10th, the German offensive had completely stalled. American reinforcements poured into the sector. The 2nd Armored Division, elements of the 1st Infantry Division, additional tank destroyer battalions equipped with M10 self-propelled guns. And above all, Allied air power dominated the battlefield. Thunderbolts, typhoons, wave after wave of aircraft attacked German armor caught in the open. Daylight movement became suicide. German tank losses mounted steadily. By August 13th, Hitler authorized withdrawal. The 4 panzer divisions had lost over 120 tanks, nearly 2/3 of their armored strength. The survivors retreated east into what would become the Falaise Pocket. There, Allied forces encircled them completely. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured, hundreds of vehicles destroyed. The German army in Normandy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. And it had begun here, in the fog, with 12 guns. Sergeant Robert Callahan survived. He stayed with the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion through the rest of the war. In November 1944, the unit finally received M10 self-propelled tank destroyers. Mobile, armored, survivable. The kind of weapons Callahan had needed at Mortain. But by then, the war was already turning. The old M5 gun, the weapon many officers called obsolete, had already proven its worth. It had held the line. It had delayed an army. It had changed the outcome of a campaign. And it had done so in the hands of men who refused to retreat. Men who fired blind into the fog because doing nothing meant certain death. Mortain would become their legacy. Not a famous battle, not widely remembered, but decisive, because sometimes victory does not belong to the strongest force. It belongs to those who hold long enough for history to catch up. In the weeks after Mortain, the paperwork began. Medals were awarded. Reports were filed. Names were typed into official records with careful precision. Several men from Company A received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. The citations described courage under fire, extraordinary heroism, and devotion to duty. But the words were brief. They did not describe the fog. They did not describe the sound of tanks moving unseen. They did not describe what it felt like to fire a weapon knowing the muzzle flash might be the last thing anyone ever saw. The official language could not capture that. The August 1944 after-action report from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was more detailed. 10 pages, typed in military format. Equipment losses, ammunition expenditure, casualty figures, tactical observations. It described how towed guns succeeded when infantry support was present, and how they failed when isolated. It recommended improved communication equipment, better coordination with infantry units, more training in night fighting. But its central conclusion was unmistakable. Convert to self-propelled tank destroyers immediately. The report stated plainly that towed guns could defend static positions, but could not maneuver, could not retreat under fire, could not survive in fluid armored warfare. At Mortain, they had achieved success. But success had come at terrible cost. By 1945, the M5 gun was already disappearing from the battlefield. Some remained in training units. Others were assigned to rear area defense. A few were transferred to Allied forces. Most were scrapped. The weapon that had stopped 4 panzer divisions became a footnote in military history. An obsolete system. A failed doctrine. But the men who had served those guns remembered differently. 37 men from the battalion had died at Mortain. 37 men who stayed at their weapons while German tanks advanced through fog and darkness. 37 men who understood the mathematics and fought anyway. Looking back, the numbers seemed impossible. 12 towed guns against 200 German tanks. No armor protection, no mobility, no visibility. Every calculation predicted annihilation within the first hour. Yet Company A held for hours that delayed an entire German offensive at the precise moment speed mattered most. It was not superior technology. The M5 gun was already considered obsolete. It was not superior tactics. Firing at muzzle flashes violated everything they had been taught. It was not superior numbers. They were outnumbered beyond reason. What made the difference was something doctrine could never quantify. Men who refused to abandon their guns. Men who fired at targets they could not see. Men who understood that retreat meant death and chose to stand instead. Military historians would later analyze Mortain in terms of terrain, observation posts, artillery coordination, and defensive depth. They would study Hill 314. They would study German operational planning. They would study Allied air superiority. But the simplest truth required no analysis. Determined defenders with adequate weapons can achieve disproportionate results. Adequate. Not perfect. Not superior. Adequate. The M5 gun could penetrate Panther armor. Not every time. Not reliably. But enough. Enough to matter. Sergeant Robert Callahan returned home to Pennsylvania in 1946. He did not speak often about Mortain. Most veterans didn't. There were larger battles. More famous victories. Normandy. The Bulge. The Rhine. Mortain became a footnote. A small engagement in a vast war. But its consequences had been enormous. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated in November 1945. Its records archived. Its veterans scattered across the country. Some attended reunions in the 1950s and 1960s. Fewer each year. By the 1980s, most were gone. Their memories disappeared with them. Today, a memorial stands near Mortain. It honors the defense of Hill 314, the 30th Infantry Division, the tank destroyers of the 823rd. But few visitors know the full story. Few know what happened in the fog before sunrise on August 7, 1944. Few know how 12 obsolete guns stopped an armored offensive that could have changed the course of the war. The Germans called it impossible. The Americans called those guns obsolete. Death traps. Not worth maintaining. But on that morning, those obsolete guns and the men who served them proved something history rarely records clearly. Impossible is not a fixed condition. Impossible is a calculation. And calculations change when men refuse to accept them. 37 men died holding their positions. They fought with weapons their own army had already abandoned. They fired blind. They stayed when retreat would have saved them. They bought for hours. For hours that allowed reinforcements to arrive. For hours that allowed aircraft to intervene. For hours that stopped a German offensive. For hours that helped secure the Allied breakout from Normandy. Sergeant Robert Callahan lived the rest of his life as a quiet man. No monuments carried his name. No headlines celebrated his decisions. But history remembered the result. Because sometimes wars are not decided by famous generals. They are decided in darkness. In fog. By men behind guns that were never meant to survive. Men who stayed long enough for history to turn. And because they stayed, the offensive failed. The breakthrough collapsed. And the road to victory remained open.